Hi, I'm Tim Raby. I'm the Chief Technical Officer of Eton Solutions. I've been working at Eton for a little over 5 years. I've been in the industry for quite a long time. I spent the first 20 years making sure that I helped get the right data to the right people. And I've spent the last 20 years trying to stop the wrong people from looking at the right data. So I'm going to talk today about cybersecurity, particularly in the context of protecting the data within a family office. So let's talk about the data that a family office typically holds and who's looking at it, who has access to your data. So in the middle of the picture there, we've got the data, which is the core of your business. So the assets that you manage are almost certainly going to be held by a custodian, but you hold the data somewhere in your systems, information about people, information about those assets, and information about financial transactions, all of which has value to somebody other than you. So let's talk about the kind of users for whom access is required. Firstly, and most importantly, sort of top right of this picture, you've got the client family users. They are going to access this information. And of course, those users are quite special in lots of ways. Let's go and take one example. You've got a multi-generational family. You've got G1s and G2s who might have few technical skills. You might actually have G3s and G4s who are very familiar with modern technology. You could have all of that in one family group. And obviously, you have varying degrees of access to technology. You then have the family office users. Those are your staff who are obviously working on behalf of the clients and have access to that data for lots of different reasons. You then have the vendors. This is your technology suppliers. Your technology suppliers are in some way going to have access to your data if they're hosting it for you, for example. So third-party vendors includes software products themselves. So you've bought a product from somebody, you've bought a cloud service from somebody where the data is hosted remotely, and you've got hosting services where some other third party might host it for you. And then you've got things like professionals, accountants, etc., who work outside of your business. And then you've got fourth parties. Fourth parties are people who work for your vendors. So they're vendors. It may well be that those people have access. So if you buy a hosted service from somebody, then they might host that data with somebody else. Very common in the modern cloud world. So you have this hierarchy of people that you're dependent upon, all of whom have access to your data. So let's talk about who else might have access to this data. The bad news is that there's lots of people out there who actually want to get access to that data because of the value I talked about earlier. The key point here is that actually in most attacks, the actual attack looks like it's going to be one of those users to you, whether it be through a user's mistake, classic one being some kind of attack where there's an email with a link and someone's clicked on it and it grabbed their credentials, or it's installing a Trojan, they've given away some information. Then, of course, the other worrying thing is that members of staff could be the bad guys. That could be in your organization, or it could be in one of your suppliers' organizations. You've then got impersonation. So once someone's lost their credentials, somebody's actually logging in using those credentials, you can't easily separate that login to your infrastructure from it being the right person, right? They've got their credentials. What differentiates them? And then you've got interception. You've got a valid user is working on your system, and in some way that traffic has been intercepted. And the classic example of that in the current world is where people are sitting on unsafe Wi-Fi networks and someone has access at the back end to traffic. So there's a lot of examples where the traffic really looks like the user. And again, even all of the other more technical vulnerabilities, in the end, they're probably all down to people. Maybe the problem is that the IT department has not configured the system properly, either by design, as in they didn't do a good job of it, or they actually designed it well, but then didn't implement it properly. So a classic example would be if your design is based upon using multi-factor authentication and you don't turn it on for one user, then you're exposed. And then the last one, which is perhaps even less obvious, is where the person who either made the mistake or did something maliciously was actually the software developer. There's been a lot of examples of that recently with Log4j and SolarWinds, where you have these zero-day malicious attacks where people have injected bad code, possibly through open source, into the software that you're using. And then you've also got mistakes, right? Bad software engineering, where someone has just left a vulnerability by accident in the software and it's been sitting there and someone's found it. But in the end, the point is it's very, very difficult to defend against an attack where it looks like it's someone that you know. So what happens when a PC that's not under your control gets a virus, when it belongs to a family member has an email account that you have no control of, gets compromised. Your users potentially working from home in the pandemic period, they're all vulnerable to attack and they are all potentially attack vectors on your infrastructure and your data. So who are the bad guys? And I guess the key point is it's not that obvious. The reality is they're people who are running a business. A common misconception, a lot of the major data breaches that have happened have been about a group of people breaking in with a view to using that data themselves to some benefit. And the classic would be, going to a retail website, stealing credit card information, etc., and then trying to use the credit cards. That isn't really how it works. What really happens is someone breaks in, they gather as much data as they can, and then they sell it. And they sell it on the dark web, it has value. So a list of email addresses has one value. A list of usernames and passwords has more value. A list of credit card information has even more value. So you sell everything, right? And then the people who buy that information then use that to go and try and get some of their money back because they probably paid for it. So they're going to go and find ways of using that information. So the first category of attack is sort of generalist. There's people, think of it a bit like marketing. You bought a list of emails, you don't really know who they are, you just throw it out there and see what happens. So a family office member, a client family user, could be a victim of quite a general attack. Much more worrying in this business is you also have specialists targeting individuals or organizations. And increasingly, sort of the high net worth world is a very clear and obvious target. A family office is kind of tough to find unless you know what you're looking for. But really, if you know what you're looking for in the modern world, it's not that difficult, right? Unfortunately, part of the problem is that these aren't just sort of hooded guys in the distance. These are people actually that you might have met one day. They could be sitting in your office. They could be sitting somewhere else. Quite a lot of examples of where that is a remote cyber attack is actually supported in some way by inside knowledge. So what can you do about it? Defend your information against the bad guys? I put user education first. In a sense, I think that really is the most important. The truth is that many of these real attacks are combinations of things, one or two series of events that lead to a breach. And quite commonly, one of the factors is someone doing something that they probably shouldn't have done. So education is very high because the more that people are conscious of what they should and shouldn't do, the less likely it is to happen, right? So it's all about training. There's lots of services out there that you can buy, allow you to test staff or third parties on their ability to go and handle various different, say, target email attacks or the kind of things that they would experience, or we experience in the industry every day. Authentication is critical. So you have to log into something to get to something these days. How are you identifying yourself uniquely and how are you making sure that nobody else can use your permission? Lots of things we can do. Multi-factor authentication, strong passwords are still good. Inactivity timers are critical, particularly on mobile devices. There's lots of things that you can do, but managing authentication, perhaps the second most important. Once someone's got access, what can they do? What data can they see? So on the assumption that someone will get through, the question is, how do you limit what they can do? What data can they see? And so we have these things like zero trust and least privilege, the idea that you limit their access to the absolute lowest common denominator. And that means cutting the data into the smallest entities that you can, and also keeping it down to time. And then communication is clearly something we all have to communicate with the outside world. You can't stop that. The business is dependent upon it. Email is, and other forms of communication are a core part of your business. And it's not just inbound we have to worry about. I'm sure you're all familiar of the terms spam and phishing and malware, but you're also going to look about things like digital loss protection, DLP, where you are worried about what information people are sending as well as what they might be receiving. Why is that important? It's very important because if a mailbox, for example, gets breached, the first thing that the bad guy will do will download a copy of all the emails that were sent and received, and they're going to go and sell it to somebody else, inevitably. So you want to try and stop people from putting highly confidential personal information in attachments and things like that in emails. So DLP can be used to help and monitor that and block it if needs be. The actual personal computers and mobile devices, the end devices, are the weakest link in all of this. They move around, they belong to other people, you may not have control over them. So there's lots of things that you have to go and do if they belong to you, and there's lots of things that you should do to try and make sure that third parties are doing the right thing as well. So there's a big list there, but I mean, I would call out modern next generation antivirus. Everything needs to be centrally managed and monitored. There's no point in just putting AV and not updating it every day. Stopping thumb drive, mobile device management on mobile devices that you have control over. All of those things essential, really. So locking down machines that you have control of is absolutely essential. Servers and hosted resources are very important. Theoretically, much easier to lock down, but much more risky if someone gets in. So the key point is making sure that you absolutely know who has access to what information at what point in time. And if anything happens that doesn't fit that model, you need to know immediately. So monitoring and access control are the key messages for servers. Let's just talk about the more technology related issues. use. So the first question that I would ask everybody is, do you really know what technology you've got? Do you have a full inventory? Do you know? Are you aware of all of the open source, for example? Clearly, I think firewalls is a term that you've probably all heard of. These are the devices that restrict access, particularly from the public internet or between different components of a network. There's a lot of different sophisticated devices out there, and the most obvious one is web application firewalls, which is the highest level of protection. There's layer 7 firewalls. There's a lot of different firewalls. It's very important to use them. It's also very important to manage them properly. APIs are very high risk at the moment. It's a very fashionable modern thing. It gives lots of software flexibility, the ability to be very agile, but it also represents the next biggest risk to users, actually, because it's a way that people can genuinely get access to your infrastructure. You can simulate being an application the same way as you can simulate being a user. So all of the same thing applies to apps and APIs that apply to users. File transfers is another variation of APIs. Similar things apply. Encryption is critical for everything. Everything that you have sitting at rest on a disk needs to be encrypted. You need to worry about where the encryption keys are managed and who has access to them. The same applies to transit. So something like HTTPS is important. It's easy to turn on, but you need to worry about the certificate. You need to make sure that it's properly signed. You need to know who has access to it. If somebody has access to your HTTP certificate, then the encryption is useless. Intrusion detection systems, these are devices that typically fit within your firewalls and will tell you that your first or second or third line defenses have been breached. DNS is very important. Everyone's accessing everything via URLs. If somebody steals your URL and points it somewhere else, then that is a very important and worrying interception. Very important that you're not dependent upon, for security purposes particularly, that you have resources from multiple suppliers. In the old days, people used to have firewalls from multiple vendors, but in the modern world of cloud services, making sure that you have security infrastructure that has some degree of independence from your cloud supplier is probably quite a valuable investment. Logs are fundamentally important to everything. You need to know what's going on. You need to have an audit trail. You need to have a way of investigating events that have happened. And in the modern world, you could have a huge amount of data. So without alerts, notifications, and smart filtering, you're just going to get bombarded. So a SIEM platform is an essential component to go and manage the mass of log and provide a sensible feed of risk-based information that you can then act on. Scanning, this covers all kinds of infrastructure. You have to have third-party penetration testing. Somebody who isn't you or your people needs to go and have some independent oversight of your security from top to bottom. Running in-house vulnerability tests all the time, or as often as possible, is a valuable component. And if you're developing code, you must do code scanning to go and identify bad code and open source code that you need to go and address and make sure that it doesn't have any security vulnerabilities or any other form of vulnerability. It's good to go and pick up on the right tools. So, for example, Microsoft 365 is a tool used by many people. It has lots of great security components, but if you buy the wrong version, you don't get the right security. You have to go and buy the premium security to get the strongest controls. It doesn't come with the basic versions. And then you need to go and configure it for your environment. The last set of defenses effectively is around about process and policies and approaches to doing things. So ransomware is an increasing threat. It's not going away, getting more and more sophisticated. If you get attacked, what do? If you don't have a copy of the information that they've either stolen or locked, then you're doomed, right? So your options are much more limited. So isolated backup, critical. For denial of service type attack, you really need to have the monitoring in place to know that it's happening. And then you've got to have some way of mitigating it. One of the interesting conflicts that one might have is the kind of belief that, sort of compliance perspective, that holding logs may have some sort of kind of risk. But as long as you don't have sensitive information in your logs, then keeping that information as long as possible so you can track patterns in retrospect is a very valuable thing. Risk management is a very valuable process for making sure that if you can't sleep, that you're actually not sleeping about the right thing. Notifications, we talked about, linked to SIEM and logging. These guys are often operating in different time zones. How do you know that your alerts are giving you the right information? And what do you do when you know something, when things happened and it's out of hours? Incident management, things will go wrong. What do you do? What's the process you follow? Who do you have to talk to? What do you need to go and do? Your HR controls, particularly things like background checks, if you don't run them for everybody who has access to your systems, or make sure that your vendors do it, then you're taking an unnecessary risk. And then review everything frequently. Literally anything process orientated, you've got to go and confirm that it's been followed. and then externally audit one way or another as regularly as possible, to then to make sure that even the reviews are working. Last point, insurance is a great tool. You have to have cyber security liability insurance these days, practically speaking, but you need to be careful with it. What will happen when you make a claim is they will employ specialist investigators who will come in and look at your infrastructure and your security. And if you don't pass muster, then that might be a reason why they don't want to pay out. So liability insurance is a very valuable tool in the portfolio, but it isn't the answer to any of this. And obviously you want your vendors to be protected as well, but you have to have some level of protection at any level in this. And you need to go and see that through the chain of vendors. Family offices are very high risk. You're managing very valuable data. You have a diverse population of users, any of whom could be victim to some form of attack that could pass through onto you. You have very complicated, sophisticated technology which serves multiple purposes, typically investment systems, accounting systems. So data is flowing between them, file transfers, for example. Modern cybersecurity is complex and costly. It costs a lot to do it properly. All of the things that I've just been talking about are expensive to install. They're expensive to maintain. They cannot stay stationary. Every time the bad guys come up with a new idea, you have to do something different to defend about. You have to have complete control over your vendors. You have to be, every service that they're providing for you is a potential risk. So that concludes the presentation for today. Hope I haven't scared you all too much. It's certainly an increasingly worrying subject for everybody, particularly in the family office world. Thank you.